Okay, but so let's go ahead and sort of get into it. I'll begin by sort of introducing G.M. Perry and Patrick McGilligan's interview of Ousmane Sembene. Just sort of like run through the kind of key things first, and then we'll sort of think about Sembene, I guess, in his own world, right? Keeping in mind, let's actually try and be precise, and I'll see what year, or just remind myself again what year this is, meaning the year of the visit and the interview. Let's see. So this is 1973. It's not even the 80s, and it's like just keeping that in mind, that the period when this is happening. But they note from the very beginning, new marker. Also, I don't know if you'll notice, but the board is so much cleaner because clearly people are still working, which I certainly appreciate. And, it's something to think about, that there are people that are still, kind of working in immense precarity right now. But they mention near the top like this idea of Sembene as a third world filmmaker, right? And again, that's why it does matter that this is happening in the that this is occurring in 1973. Still in the kind of the midst of the Cold War. So this distinction during this period is much more like the first world of the capitalist democracies, and then the second world of the Soviet Union, China, North Korea, and then the third world of the countries and places that don't fit into that framework, but still, there's still this kind of the economic significance, right? It's like, and I just constantly want you to be paying, as I have insisted throughout the semester, paying attention to this this kind of language where it's like, these are not neutral distinctions. There is a kind of order and a hierarchy. And I actually, today I tend to think of like when we use these distinctions, kind of more laterally, like a foot race, right? Like who's in first, who's in second, who's in third, right? Because the foot race is, capital, right? It's capitalism. Again, we've talked about this before, but developing undeveloped, right? The other kind of major sort of node that this hits on, right, is again third cinema. But this movement of primarily, Latin American filmmakers that was very politically minded, and I think that as we saw in the midterm, like these movements all are kind of in dialogue with one another. Clearly Sembene is someone who is very much kind of thinking about world cinema as he's working, right, and in relation to Africa and Senegalese cinema, right. And so to that, on 36, Sembene, like in his own words, like what his work is about is, quote, the basic message of pride and confidence in the heritage and culture of Africa's native peoples. So we see this in the film in Hala as well, but so if we have like, another way to put it, we could say is like a regional, right, historical specificity. So, another way to put this is like whether we think about like tradition, or it's like that which is inherited, right? But I think and I'll talk about this a little bit later. Sembene is very, very careful about this in a sort of historiographical sense, right? Because he talks about like what is like art versus airport art, like the idea of airport art, which I want to come back to, which I think is sort of really explicit in Black Girl, and also in the sort of margins of Hala as well. But the way that, you know, like the mask is kind of a decorative piece throughout the film, throughout these films, right? But they're used in very, very specific and explicit ways. And so what I mean by that is the idea of, like, let's say like a regional or traditional mask becomes a piece of airport art. This is like an instance where we see Sembène's kind of, let's say, historiographical sort of how do I put it? Sort of approach or thinking, in the sense that, you know, let's say like that which is, you know, the heritage and culture of Africa's native peoples. This is something that can also be kind of co-opted, right? It's also something that's subject basically to change, right? So it's like he is making the distinction between, you know, like the mask in, like, that gets like thrown about at the end of Black Girl, but that the French couple kind of treat very differently. That we have to be kind of, you know, critical of these things, of like the very idea of like something like authenticity. I think what you know, he sort of at least the films are kind of doing is playing with the very idea of authenticity. Although I think that simultaneously there is a sense that there is an authentic or a more authentic in these films, even though, again, like personally, I would say I would prefer like there's something that's more historically specific. And the historical specificity of airport art is very, very different from that, which, let's say, kind of remains in a region, right? So his output is 11 films. They note that I think it was only 5 films that he had done by this point, right? But I do, again, just kind of return to points that we sort of talked about throughout the semester. Both Perry and McGilligan talk about, right, the movement of international cinema, or, you know, history of international cinema, the course. How does film move, right? And we see, again, some of the kind of like phenomena that we've seen time and time again this semester, which is the way in which, right, Sembène is heralded in the U.S. and Europe, right? His films travel very well in the so-called West, right? And yet, in his home country of Senegal, right, or in Africa itself, and in relation to both like the movement of international cinema. So on one hand, we have the movement of international cinema. We also have colonial power well after decolonization. And what I mean by that is the way that France still has a great deal of say of the ways that his films traveled, at least in the 70s. So on 36, Perry and McGilligan note, in Africa, however, these volatile works usually are banned, typically through pressure brought by the French government, which maintains a vigilant watch over its former colonies. So there's multiple dimensions to this, right? For one, France still has a stake and a say, more importantly, right? Independence means self-governance and sovereignty, right? And yet, you know, is it ever truly independent, right? In this case, France still has a say in West Africa, its former colonies. It still has an interest. It also can kind of intervene, right? And one of the ways it's intervening is in the distribution and exhibition of Sembène's works. Why? Because they're volatile. So again, we have, so let's put up the players. There's Senegal, there's France, and there's Ousmane Sembène. So in thinking about both national cinemas and international cinema, we have a Senegalese filmmaker who's talking about the colonial and post-colonial relationship between these two countries, you know, and this country is basically meddling in his ability to show his own work domestically, and why. What are the national interests, right? Again, again, thinking about international cinema, and especially the movement and sort of distribution of international cinema, makes very clear that, like, how can cinema, possibly be apolitical, right? And just thinking, again, in terms that that France has a stake in West Africa, right? That this is where they had colonized as an imperial power. Okay. Quick sip of coffee. So as far as Sembene's background, Perry and McGilligan are quick to note, right, that he only had 3 years of vocational training beyond primary school, right? More importantly, that unlike other of his contemporaries and other filmmakers, that Sembene was not European educated, right? But even that's like, well, I guess, yeah, because his experience in, well, that's the thing, right? It's like, it's also, like, he wasn't educated in Europe, right? But it's also not entirely true that he was, and this is one of those things that I've brought up before, is that, like, how can we treat something as, like, entirely, let's say, domestic or entirely foreign, right? When there's so much slippage and movement between them, whether it's between capitalism or colonialism or a mixture of the both, right? But it's like, he's not European educated, right? But he spends time in France, he spends time in the Soviet Union. So it's also not, and he watches films, right? He has a vested interest in cinema, which is a global phenomenon. So it's not as if there isn't a kind of international sort of cultural exchange, or I don't know if that's the right word to put it, kind of engagement on his part that's not happening. And it's precisely those kind of, like, notions of metropolitanism, right, that Hala really gets to, and even sort of, is very critical of, like, El Hajji drinking Evian water, which, to which his daughter, basically responds, like, I don't drink imported water, right, that kind of thing. He did come from a literary background, also self-trained, right? But of particular interest, and he mentions this himself, right, is his colonial experience, his actual experience in colonialism, right? In the sense that he was a forced enlistee of the French army during World War II. And just imagine the cruelty of that you're not serving, you're not enlisting voluntarily, but as a part of the colony, you are forced to serve the colonizing power in a war that's technically not your own. I just want you to kind of, like, think about that for a second. It's kind of horrifying, right? So those are the kind of coordinates that I just want to point out about Sembene, is not only his colonial experience, right, but his experience as part of the kind of, let's say, proletarian, so his working class experience, where he does go to France, Marseille, and works as both. Not only does he work as a dock worker, but he works as a union organizer, right? And so in relation so we have, like, his relationship with France, right? But we also have the sort of way that labor becomes a major kind of question, especially I think in Hala. I mean, labor's certainly there. Especially I think in terms of, like, the regional notions of labor, as opposed to kind of, like, more kind of, like, colonial notions. But especially the black girl, clearly, right? Because we have the main character, working in the couple's home, right? And then his training in the Soviet Union in the early 60s. This is kind of not entirely here nor there. It's a little bit less about Sembene, but something I want to point out nonetheless. On 37, this is in the first full paragraph. Perry and McGilligan note, after talking about Sembene's training in the Soviet Union in the 1960s, so I guess we'll just kind of leave that there, but to try to detect Russian influence on his work, or indeed any influences, is mostly futile, for Sembene is very much his own creator. He is one of those rare talents who make film production seem an absolutely natural act. I just want to point that out as a piece of kind of rhetoric and writing that I do think, like, you know, it's kind of reflective of its times, but it's the sort of writing that I would want you to kind of avoid, because, it sounds nice, but it's not really, it's not really fact-based, I would guess, and it just, I just don't think it's true that there aren't influences. Like, of course there are going to be influences. Like, no one works in a vacuum, right? And it's not doing Sembene a disservice to say that, there is a specificity to him that's his, right? But that, here I go touching my face. But that at the same time, it's like, no, of course he's working and responding to other filmmakers. It just, I don't think this is doing him any services. Relatedly, right after that, I mean, they're trying to comment on Mandabi, but they note that, that some people might call it an African, like that. Actually, what do they precisely say? One might view Mandabi as no less than an African bicycle thief. I've brought this up before too. But African bicycle thief. I want you to be very careful of these sort of formulations, because what happens, this is the modifier, right? But this is the actual subject. And so whatever is being, like, so, and Mandabi is the African bicycle thief. So we're setting up a relationship of this. But this, the subject, always becomes, I mean, the subject of the formulation is Mandabi, but in this formulation, it's bicycle thief, right? And so this is always going to be set up as the kind of origin, right? Or the center. This is always going to be derivative. And so, even though it seems harmless, it's propagating another relationship which goes back to first, second, and third that suggests a kind of natural direction of the world. And it's not just two films, it's also Europe and Africa, right? As if, Africa and other places can only ever be derivative, and the origin is always going to be Europe and the West, right? It's the same way. It's like, if you like, I mean, even like something as I mean, I've talked about this with Bollywood, right? But even something as kind of seemingly innocent as the New Wave, it's as if the French New Wave, sure, historically, it might be one of the more significant to come first, but naming every other New Wave after it does still kind of inadvertently reinforce this relationship. So that's just something that I want to kind of point out. My nose is really itching. I'm going to have to take a break, but we're at a break point anyway. But one last thing, that what Sembene points out, on 37, moving from, like, just two ideas, abstract social consciousness, and this goes back to the point, Pfaff's point, right, that these are less about characters and more about types, but a kind of abstract expression of ideas, as opposed to direct, historically oriented attack. Right. And to go back to, like, volatile films. So this goes back to the question that I began with, like the question of, critique, how does critique occur, as opposed to like kind of an abstract expression of critique. What does like a direct, historically oriented critique look like? Also the notion of a volatile film and volatility in critique, and that in relation to art. These are kind of the big questions that I want us to be thinking about. Okay, so we'll move on in a second.